exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Seafood T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today. If I'm keeping count, we're running around episode number 120. And if it's your first time here, welcome. I work hard at trying to provide you some information as a traditional martial artist for whatever reason you might practice. Some information that might be informative, educational, as well as entertaining from time to time. I can also tell you without a shadow of a doubt that if this is your first time here or if you're just trying to get used to the program, you are in the audience of some of the sharpest and finest martial artists in the world. And I mean that sincerely. There are people around the world that practice practical, traditional martial arts for a variety of different reasons. Some of them practice for sport. Some of them practice for good health. Some practice to make sure that they can protect themselves as well as people they care about. And one of the things I always try to make sure that you know, as much as you can, I enjoy hearing from you and what you think about the program and how it may affect your martial arts. And in fact, in the episodes coming up, we're going to have stories from you. Some of the folks who've written in to say, hey, this is something I just experienced in the practical martial arts. It made me think about this podcast that you did on this particular topic. And we're going to take it and research it like we do all the others and try to lay it out there because nothing is sacred here. We, including myself, will sometimes throw myself under the bus. Excuse me. We all work hard in the practical martial arts. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in this episode is that if you're not pushing and pressing and finding new edges of yourself through your journey in the martial arts, and I mean question it, question yourself, find new things about yourself, then I would probably argue that you're not trying enough, or you need either a new teacher or a new experience in the martial arts, because martial arts is a journey. I mean, if you listen to some of the fine folks like Ando Mirzwa, Jamie Clubb, Ian Abernathy, Chris Wilder, and Andrea Harkins, for example, if you listen to those folks or follow them on their feeds and things along those lines, you're going to find in their stories change along the way. Some of the things that they learned, some of the things that they learned they could do better, some of the things that they learned that didn't work before. But it's all just part of the journey. You're not worried about judging. We're just worried about keep moving and keep pushing yourself. As an introduction to this particular episode, we're going to be in part 3 of the book review by Dr. Ben Junkins, who you can find by going to kungfupodcast.com/Ben, and a book review on the novel by Professor Adam Franks titled Tai Ji Chuan and the Search for the Little Old Chinese Man. Some of the things we're going to cover in this particular episode are park lives in secret spaces, the Tai Chi community, and the Chinese government. Who's watching you while you're doing your martial arts? And we're going to be looking at finding an identity by sketching into the shadows. How identity is never static. It's always moving from one arc to another, back and forth in between these two poles. And your identity isn't alive unless it's moving. And that makes martial arts a perfect place to study it. Now, I would suggest, if this is your first episode, go back to the first one that you'd be looking for is titled The Promise of Every Martial Arts Teacher. And the next one after that is titled The 5 Ingredients to Martial Culture. And before I go into the book review, I sent a note out to a friend of the program, Jesse Enkamp. You might recognize his website titled karatebyjesse.com. He had written an article titled 10 Amazing Karate Places I Visited in Okinawa but Never Told You About. We know that martial arts has a long and diverse history in every culture of existence that I know of. Romans, Greeks, Viking, Chinese, Okinawan, Thailand, you name it. And sometimes it is the personalities that become famous. At other times it's the events or the circumstances surrounding the events that become famous. And other times, it is the spaces or places that these martial arts events take place that become famous. And that's why I wanted to lead off with Jesse Encamp's article titled The 10 Amazing Karate Places. As the title says, there's 10 places that Jesse lists. I just wanted to use the first place as an example of how a space and a place can become part of martial history. The first place he lists is called the Secret Cave of Chuan. And he has a picture here of a cave that looks to be kind of growing underneath this little forest. There's some inscriptions on a stone and what appears to be an altar just on the outside of the doorway in this particular picture. And then another picture where you can get the outline of an altar that is just inside of the cave. And Jesse writes, quote, "According to my sources in Okinawa, this cave was the place where a shipwrecked Chinese sailor, or pirate, named Chuan took refuge a very long time ago. This cave is actually in the middle of a graveyard in the hills of Tamari, a spooky place to live in. Many noted karate experts and researchers today have done research on this man, Chuan, but it is still a rather big mystery exactly how he influenced Okinawan karate. Some people even think he was the originator of the Pinan Heian kata we have today. All we know for sure is that many old karate masters came here to this exact cave to get instruction from Master Chuan in the secret art of Chinese boxing. Here you can see the inside of the cave in a little more detail. Notice the altar, incense, and so on, neatly stuffed inside. This cave is nowadays considered holy or sacred, so I didn't enter. Not that I'm afraid of ghosts or anything. Anyway, it was an interesting place." Well, the influence of Chuan in the Chinese martial arts as far as this individual's historical and legendary influence was on the katas and the karate will be saved for another podcast. But what I wanted to do was introduce it as an example of how a place or a space, as such as a cave, can become so important to so many people as far as their martial arts journey is concerned. And that will act as our segue as we continue to follow Ben's writing into Chapter 3, titled Park Lives and Secret Spaces. Chapter 3, Park Lives and Secret Spaces, moves beyond an examination of individual informants and begins to ask questions about the broader community. Specifically, how do the spaces in which martial artists practice contribute to their sense of place and formation of identity? This was one of the critical questions that Frank wished to investigate when he began his dissertation research. He had originally visited the Wu Tai Chi clan on a previous trip to Shanghai before he ever began his dissertation research. In the intervening time where he had visited and then before he started the research, the public park that they had traditionally practiced at was extensively renovated and rebuilt. How would this elimination of green spaces affect the local community and its martial arts? Frank's initial fears about the disappearance of public parks proved to be unnecessary. City officials and urban planners have actually gone to some lengths to create open spaces which incorporate elements of the past while looking to the future. Still, the disruption of the park provided another opportunity to observe how the Wu clan was structured. Internal political and social tensions outwardly manifested as groups came together or physically distanced themselves. Some instructors might disappear from a particular park altogether after a particular sharp falling out with the members of the lineage. On a personal note, if your system doesn't run through a lineage type of format, One of the things you want to understand is that it can get real messy. We've had several podcasts. In fact, we've dedicated, I want to say, a few hours of podcasts just talking about the differences between lineages and history and all kinds of political things that can go on through the process. And there can be so many illusions in this whole process. You get self-acclaimed grandmasters who all of a sudden puts together a program and gets a little bothered with somebody down the line, and all of a sudden characters are added into the lineage, some important characters are removed, and it's all because this master in the lineage is having a tantrum. And that's the type of thing that can happen in some of the lineage systems. Well, Tai Chi Chuan would fall under that sort of list. And just as a reminder, Ben is a practitioner of the Chinese martial arts. However, he does not practice Tai Chi. At least that's what he reports at the time that he wrote this review. He is primarily a Wing Chun man. And Ben continues by writing, Wing Chun, with its origins in southern China and heavy emphasis on boxing, is usually practiced indoors or in some private spaces. It was very interesting for me to consider how one's physical environment affects one's perception and even the practice of your art. We can wonder how much of the 20th century development of Tai Chi or Bakwa might have been influenced by their very public training points. Clearly, this choice of location was not a coincidence. There was conscious efforts to cultivate these and other martial arts as popular forms of mass physical culture in the 1920s and the 1930s. While the discussion of physical place was fascinating, I missed the intense personal and ethnographic descriptions of Chapter 2. I was also left wondering about the interactions of various martial artists of different styles. Franks concentrates his discussions of park culture almost solely on the Wu Tai Chi community and a couple of individuals who were involved with Qigong. Yet it seems that any large central park in China will also have a number of stylists from different arts. Some of these will be internal styles, such as Xingyi and Bakwa, and they may share some points of cultural identity with Tai Chi. Others, like Shaolin or plum blossom boxing, might be quite different both in terms of their physical practice and internal culture. So we could ask the question, how do different arts share space? And what does it mean to be a martial artist in a more collective sense? At this point, Ben is going to reference Kung Fu Podcast Agent of Action D.S. Ferrer, who is an anthropologist and wrote the book that we have mentioned here on the program before, Coffee Shop Gods, Chinese Martial Arts of the Singapore Diaspora. You can find it in the Storied Accounts category at kungfupodcast.com. Ben continues, and he says, Ferrer noted that most of the individuals who studied traditional martial arts in the public parks of Singapore did so because they wanted to be able to work with multiple teachers of different styles. This mixing and matching was seen as a modern and progressive approach to the Chinese martial arts, as opposed to the more sectarian private schools of the red light district. Interestingly, many of the northern arts, such as Tai Chi and Jing Wu, were the ones being taught in the parks, while it was the southern arts, such as Chole Foot, that were most likely practiced indoors. It would be very interesting to know whether similar dynamics could be observed in the parks of Shanghai, and if not, why? We'll pause there on Ben's review. As I mentioned earlier in the series, authors of dissertations have reported on many interviews that when they turn their work into a novel, it gets changed to meet a different editorial expectation. In Frank's dissertation, he spent the majority of his years researching and studying in 3 parks. And in the section I'm going to reference now, it is titled, The Life of the Park. And he wrote, quote, Each park in Shanghai has its unique character, largely determined by the people who inhabit the park, its association with particular historical figures or activities, and whatever construction and development is going in the neighborhood that surrounds the park. While I probably practiced in 24 parks in Shanghai alone during the course of my research, in 2001, I mainly spent time in 3 parks: People's Park, the former Shanghai racetrack, and coupled with People's Square, the central hub of the city; Haiyang Park, which for decades was one of the central meeting places in the French concession, and one of the closest parks to the Ma family home; and Hongshan Park, the park closest to my apartment building. While I met with my teachers at each of these parks, although rarely at the Hongshan Park, I often ventured there at other times when my teachers were absent, or stayed in the park for several hours after most of the other Wu-style players left in order to practice on my own. In this way, I acquired a circle of friends and acquaintances outside the immediate Wu-style community, some of them involved in Tai Chi chuan, some of them in other martial styles." End quote. I was personally intrigued by the description Frank gave of going to Hongshan Park. He says that the park opened at 6 a.m. and it was a big park, plenty of space for everyone. But each morning there was a gathering and huddling of people, similar to people getting ready to gather in and rush into a subway or bus, but not quite that bad. But the people would have their passes ready, and Franks would have his monthly pass ready so the gatekeeper could see people as they rushed through at a leisurely pace. Franks later writes in the dissertation that other styles such as Shaolin, Bakwa Jiang, sword forms, and Xingyi were also present during his practices at these parks. While reading Chapter 3, Ben wanted a deeper discussion of the interaction between the Tai Chi community and the government. Frank mentions a couple of times how the government actually encouraged martial artists and bussed Tai Chi practitioners into the municipal parks after the 1999 crackdown on Falun Gong and the Qigong movement. This was all part of a planned attempt to fill the social and geographical space left by the sudden disappearance of a major social movement. This is where Franks is going to have an interesting entry of an account one day at the park, just after that government crackdown. Franks is talking about one of his instructors named Shu, and he says, quote, "He could become quite demonstrative, but his movements were unusual and, coupled with his behavior, occasionally attracted unwanted attention from the police. During one conversation, we stood by the park's arboretum and chatted about internal methods. The methods Shu showed me included a series of intense inhalations and exhalations. The noise that Shu produced finally prompted a policeman who had been watching us to come over and inquire. While the policeman did not push the issue, the incident made us nervous enough to end the conversation and move on for the day. Particularly since the Falun Gong crackdown, everyone in the park assumed Big Brother was watching. The added presence of a foreigner made the situation even more tense. Tai Chi Chuan is not the only martial art practiced in the parks. I occasionally watched an American acquaintance practice a Shaolin method near the Nanjing roadside of the park. Watching people walk Bakwa Jiang was a common sight, as were the occasional Xingyi Chuan players walking their lines of joining attacks back and forth." End quote. Ben's review continues, but we're already about 20 minutes in, and there's much more to go, and we're in no rush. Now, one of the things that occurred to me as I was, processing this particular episode and getting it ready was my experiences as far as learning the martial arts, where I would dare say it seemed like at least 70%, 75% of the time we were outside. That was particularly true when we were practicing things like the Hop Gar, or Lama Pai, as many people know it, Choli Foot, A lot of times Bakwa was outside, and that was a lot of fun because you were using the forest and working around into the trees in the woods and things like that. But we spent most of our time outside, and as much of the meditation as we could do was outside. There were many times when we were inside, but all the windows and doors were open, so basically it was just a shelter over the top. It'd be like being underneath a lean-to or something. And the general rule of thumb about when we would come back in was simple. It was basically whenever the environment would get very disruptive. That was usually the case under, let's say, if it started to thunder or having lightning coming in. But something steady like cold, snow, or rain wasn't considered a disruptive force, and so there were times where we would be outside standing in the snow up to our ankles doing our meditation. But even after all of these years, I could still walk you to the same parkway that we would practice Bakwa, around the tree that we would stand under as we would do Tai Chi. There was always something special that became ingrained as part of the journey through the martial arts. And preparing this episode was a reminder of how important places can be to our martial arts journey. So I want to go back to Jesse Incamp's article, where the second place on his list of 10 was the Jundokan and the bust of Miyagi Chojun. Jesse writes, quote, "The Jundokan is one of the most famous dojos in Okinawa, especially in Goju-ryu circles. The Jundokan is a true old-style Okinawan dojo, and you can really smell it in the air when you enter the place. The walls are covered with original calligraphy by Miyagi himself and others, and along the walls are various old-school strength training implements. Well used, I can tell you. But at the far end of the dojo is what truly makes Jundokan unique among Okinawan dojos. A life-size bust of the founder of Goju-ryu himself, Mr. Miyagi Chojun, who lived from 1888 to 1953. End quote. As Jesse put together his list, I went ahead and did a quick look, and I found that there are many types of sacred places. In fact, there's a whole website called sacredsites.com that have categorical lists, and one of those is titled Places of Peace and Power. And they have 20 or more categories listed there, and some of them, for example, are the sacred mountains, like Olympus, or sacred bodies of water, like Pushkar Lake, or ancient monasteries, like Lhasa. Well, during this episode, we're talking about park lives and doing your martial arts, secret spaces, and sacred places. Well, in 2009, Joseph Yee published a book called God and Karate on the South Side, Bridging Differences, Building American Communities. And as he describes, there are many types of places that cultures hold sacred. Churches and temples, for example, just as I shared with you from sacredsites.com. Mr. Yee's story takes place around a Tong Soo Do school on the south side of Chicago. His assessments and stories of identities can be considered almost parallel to what Frank was describing in his experience as a non-Asian learning martial arts in China. In the introduction, Mr. Yee states that the primary question of his book is to discover, quote, in the United States, what kinds of organizations and institutions sustain personal interaction and trust across diverse social cleavages, such as race and class. Further down in the transcript, and it's actually Chapter 7, and he has a heading titled Broadening Identities. Mr. Yee presents that various other places and spaces, much like the ones we've been discussing, try to serve as a place for various types of people to share a common bond, perhaps through faith, philosophy, or education. But yet, there is something very special about martial arts. He goes on to describe that the larger tournaments brought together many karate participants from all around the region. And the martial arts tournament, this place and this space, this dedicated event, became a place for, quote, empowering students to participate in larger, socially mixed settings. The evangelical Christian, black, feminist, and gay/lesbian themed schools helped strengthen universal and mainstream aspirations. One could identify with a particular ethno-racial, religious, or sexual group and still aspire to participate in the mainstream of American life." End quote. So as we bring in episode 120, Park Lives and Secret Spaces, to a close, together we looked at how martial arts is interrelated to the spaces and places, how various places, whether they were inside or outside, perhaps more naturally occurring or more man-developed like the park that Frank attended, can affect our experience of the martial arts. We began looking at the question of how some styles tend to be, not always, but tend to be more orientated toward outside and public presentation. For example, as Tai Chi practitioners were bussed in to make sure that there was a public presentation of some form of martial arts that the government approved of and not just a gap sitting out there in the space, while other martial arts tend to be better suited, or it just might be wiser to keep it indoors. Because as Frank points out, you don't want to become too demonstrative, or perhaps be going through your forms and katas with purpose and speed with the local governance watching. When we follow back up on Tai Chi Chuan and the search for the little old Chinese man, we're going to be looking at how was the government involved in promoting and choosing which styles were going to be banned or not. We'll be taking a field trip together to legendary Chinese martial arts places. For example, a real comparison between the Qin village, the home of the Tai Chi Chuan, and the Shaolin Temple. How could these two places that were so geographically close together and resonate with such legendary stories be treated and look so much differently in around the year 2000 when Frank was there? We're going to hear a little bit about the differences between a martial art and a public art. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me today as we looked at Park Lives, Secret Places. And we took a little inside glimpse of Jesse Encamp's sacred places in the karate, and we're going to be looking a little bit further in the Chinese martial arts and some sacred places there. As I bring this episode to a close, I got my bags partially packed, got some equipment ready, and I'm really excited about seeing Troy Price, Paul Cody, Alex Ormaza, and many of the other people, Bob Speed, just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, for the Shuri-Te Martial Arts Seminar. If you are interested, I believe you can still sign up. You can go to kungfupodcast.com/Shuri-Te, and it'll take you right over there to their webpage. If you find this program enjoyable and educational and would like to support me in any way and trying to help it get it produced each week, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/support, and I have a list of things there that's extremely helpful for me to help get this program researched, recorded, edited, and published each week. And anything that you want to do is greatly appreciated. So no matter where you practice, why you practice, or which style you practice, I hope you get out there, do your due diligence, put in your focus, and have a great experience in your martial arts journey. I'll be talking with you again next week. Take care.